The orange glow of the construction flare was the only thing standing between me and the suffocating blackness of the high desert. But as I slowed my car to a crawl, I realized the man holding the signaling paddle wasn't wearing a radio, a badge, or a look of professional concern. He was just standing there, perfectly still, staring through my windshield with eyes that looked like two empty holes in the fabric of the night. I had been driving for nearly 7 hours straight, trying to make it across the state line before dawn to save a few dollars on a motel room, but the fatigue was starting to settle into my bones like a heavy lead weight. The road, a neglected stretch of asphalt known only as Route 14, had been empty for the last 50 miles, leaving me alone with the hum of my tires and the occasional moth suicidal enough to dive into my headlights. When the first road work ahead sign appeared, it felt out of place, mostly because I hadn't seen a single piece of heavy machinery or a support truck for hours. I should have known right then that something was wrong, but when you are exhausted and deep in the middle of nowhere, your brain looks for reasons to trust the world rather than reasons to fear it. The man in the high-visibility vest stepped into the center of the lane, raising his hand to signal me to stop. I rolled my window down just a crack, the dry, cold desert air rushing in and carrying the faint scent of copper and old grease. He leaned down, his face remaining in the shadows cast by the brim of his dusty cap. He told me that a semi-truck had jackknifed 3 miles ahead and had spilled a load of industrial chemicals across both lanes, making the main road impassable until at least noon the next day. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it in years, and he kept tapping his fingers against the top of my door frame in a rhythmic, nervous pattern. "There is a county bypass about 100 yards back," he said, pointing a gloved finger toward a narrow, unpaved opening in the scrub brush that I had barely noticed when I drove past it. "It's a bit rough, but it will loop you right back onto the highway about 15 miles past the wreck." I thanked him, feeling a wave of relief that I wouldn't be stuck on the shoulder of the road for 12 hours. I put the car in reverse, backed up to the mouth of the dirt path, and turned my wheel. As my headlights swept across the man one last time, I noticed something that made the hair on my neck stand up. He wasn't looking at the road anymore. He was watching me go, and he was pulling a mobile phone out of his pocket, his thumb moving rapidly as if he were sending a signal. The dirt road was narrow, barely wide enough for my compact SUV, and the jagged rocks underneath my tires sounded like breaking glass in the silence of the canyon. I drove for 10 minutes, then 20, waiting for the promised loop that would lead me back to the safety of the pavement. But the road only grew narrower, the walls of the dry wash rising up on either side of me until I felt like I was driving through a grave. My GPS had long since lost its signal, the blue dot spinning aimlessly in a sea of gray on my dashboard screen. I started to wonder if I had missed a turn, or if the man had been mistaken about the distance. How long does it take to travel 15 miles on a dirt track? I checked my odometer and realized I had already gone 12, but the path was turning into nothing more than a pair of ruts in the sand. That was when I saw it. A pair of headlights appearing in my rearview mirror. They were far back at first, just 2 pinpricks of light bouncing violently against the canyon walls. I felt a momentary surge of comfort, thinking another traveler had been redirected by the worker, but that comfort vanished when I realized how fast they were gaining on me. They weren't driving like a lost tourist. They were driving like someone who knew every curve of this wash. I sped up, my suspension groaning as I hit a deep dip in the sand, but the lights behind me only grew brighter, filling my cabin with a harsh, blinding glare. I looked for a place to pull over, a spot wide enough to let them pass, but the canyon walls were sheer rock now. I was trapped in a corridor of stone with a predator at my back. I pushed the gas pedal harder, my engine screaming in protest, but the vehicle behind me slammed into my rear bumper with a sickening crunch of plastic and metal. My head snapped back, and for a second, the world went blurry. Why would they hit me? There was no reason for a regular driver to be this aggressive in the middle of a desert. The truck behind me hit me again, harder this time, trying to push my back wheels off the stable part of the track and into the soft, deep sand near the edge of the wash. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, fighting to keep the car straight. I realized then that this wasn't an accident and it wasn't road rage. I had been funneled here. The man with the paddle hadn't been a worker. He had been a scout. Suddenly, the canyon opened up into a wide, flat basin, and the dirt road split into 3 different directions. I veered to the left, hoping to lose them in the dust, but as my headlights panned across the clearing, I saw them. 3 other cars, all abandoned, all stripped of their tires and glass, sitting like skeletons in the moonlight. They weren't just random wrecks. They were parked in a neat, organized row, hidden from the main road by the high ridges of the basin. I didn't stop to look closer. I kept the pedal floored, but the truck behind me was faster. It pulled alongside me, a massive, rusted-out dually with a reinforced steel bumper. I looked over and saw the driver, a man wearing the exact same high-visibility vest as the scout back on the highway. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking directly at me, a calm, terrifyingly patient smile on his face. He began to steer his truck into my lane, slowly grinding his heavy metal frame against my driver's side door, the sound of shrieking metal filling the air. I knew if I stayed on this path, he would eventually pin me against the rocks or flip my car entirely. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it might break. I saw a steep, rocky embankment to my right, a risky, narrow slope that looked like an old goat trail. It wasn't a road, but it was the only place his wide truck couldn't follow. I waited until the very last second, until his front tire was inches from my door, and then I slammed on my brakes. The truck, carrying too much momentum, shot past me, its tires throwing up a massive cloud of choking dust. I shifted into low gear and gunned it toward the embankment, my car bouncing so violently I hit my head on the ceiling. I could hear the roar of his engine as he threw his truck into reverse, the tires spinning and screaming as he tried to turn around in the soft sand. I reached the top of the ridge, my tires spinning for a terrifying second before catching on a flat shelf of rock. I didn't turn back. I drove across the pathless plateau, ignoring the scraping of branches against my paint and the warning lights flashing on my dashboard. I drove until I saw the distant, beautiful glow of a real highway. Not the one I had been on, but a larger interstate miles to the west. When I finally reached the pavement and saw the lights of a crowded truck stop, I didn't stop moving until I was surrounded by people. I sat in the parking lot for an hour, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't even hold a water bottle. When the police eventually arrived and I told them about the construction zone, they looked at each other with a grim expression. They told me there hadn't been any roadwork scheduled on Route 14 for months. When they went back to check the area the next morning, they found the orange flares and the signs, but the man and the truck were gone. All they found were the tracks of my tires leading up a cliffside no car was ever meant to climb, and the row of stripped vehicles in the basin, their owners never to be heard from again. I still don't drive at night if I can help it, because every time I see an orange light in the distance, I wonder if it's a warning or a trap set just for me. The local rental listing had described the property as a secluded sanctuary for the soul, but as I pulled my car onto the overgrown gravel driveway, it looked more like a place where souls went to be forgotten. The house was a tiny, modern structure made of dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass, perched on the edge of a jagged ravine in a part of the forest that the sun didn't seem to care for. There wasn't another house for 20 miles, and my cell phone had dropped its last bar of service 5 minutes before I turned off the main road. I was looking for peace and quiet to finish my graduate thesis, but the moment I stepped out of the car, the silence felt less like peace and more like a held breath. I found the key in a heavy metal lockbox bolted to the porch railing, and the door creaked open to reveal an interior that was surprisingly high-end. It had polished concrete floors, a stainless steel kitchen, and a lofted bedroom that looked out over the dark canopy of the trees. It was beautiful, but there was a strange smell lingering in the air, something metallic and sharp, like old pennies mixed with bleach. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the scent of a house that had been closed up for a long time, and I began to unpack my things. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, the glass walls of the house turned into giant mirrors, reflecting the interior back at me and making it impossible to see what was happening in the woods outside. I felt exposed like a bug in a jar. I reached for the remote to lower the electronic blackout shades, but when I pressed the button, nothing happened. I tried the switch on the wall, but it just clicked uselessly. I figured I would just have to deal with it until morning, so I set up my laptop on the kitchen island and tried to focus on my work. About an hour into my writing, I heard a sound that made my heart skip a beat. It was a soft, rhythmic thud, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. It sounded like someone dropping a heavy bag of flour over and over again. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening so hard my ears started to ring. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling or perhaps a large animal taking shelter in the crawl space beneath the concrete slab. I decided to make some coffee to settle my nerves, but when I opened the cabinet above the sink, I noticed something odd. There was a small, circular hole drilled into the back of the wooden cabinet, just large enough for a camera lens. I felt a cold chill wash over me. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and peered into the hole, but I could only see darkness. My mind began to race with questions. Who would put a hole there? Was I being watched right now? I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid, but then I noticed the dust. The house was spotless, except for a thin trail of fresh, white drywall dust leading from the base of the stairs to a small access panel in the ceiling of the pantry. I climbed onto a chair and pushed the panel up just an inch. It wasn't an attic. It was a narrow crawl space filled with old insulation and wires. And there, sitting right at the edge of the opening, was a half-eaten sandwich and a pair of binoculars. My blood turned to ice. Someone was in the house with me, or they had been here very, very recently. I jumped down from the chair, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I needed to leave, but as I reached for my car keys on the counter, the power suddenly cut out. The entire house plunged into total darkness, leaving me standing in a glass box in the middle of the wilderness. The only light came from the pale, sickly glow of my laptop screen. I grabbed my laptop, thinking I could use the screen as a light source to get to the door, but as I picked it up, a notification popped up on the screen. It was an incoming file transfer via a local wireless connection, something I hadn't set up. The file was titled Last Night.mp4. My shaking hand moved the cursor and clicked play. The video was grainy and shot in night vision, showing a view of the lofted bedroom where I had planned to sleep. In the video, I saw myself lying in bed, fast asleep. Then, a shadow moved from the corner of the frame. A man, tall and impossibly thin, crawled out from under the bed. He didn't attack me. He just sat on the edge of the mattress and watched me breathe for 3 hours. The video ended, and the silence in the house was broken by a sound from the pantry. The access panel in the ceiling hit the floor with a loud bang. "I liked it better when you were asleep," a voice whispered from the darkness of the kitchen. It was a low, wet sound, like someone speaking through a throat full of gravel. I didn't scream. I didn't have the air for it. I bolted for the front door, but I heard the heavy thud of feet hitting the floor behind me. I didn't look back. I fumbled for the handle, threw the door open, and sprinted into the freezing night air. I didn't even try to get to my car. I knew he would catch me before I could get the engine started. Instead, I ran toward the ravine, sliding down the muddy embankment and hiding behind a massive fallen pine tree. I stayed there for hours, huddled in the dirt, watching the house on the hill. I could see him through the glass walls. He was walking through the rooms, holding my laptop, looking for me. He looked calm, almost disappointed. He spent the night tidying up the kitchen and sitting in the chair where I had been working, staring out into the woods where he knew I was hiding. As the first light of dawn began to gray the sky, I heard the sound of an engine. It wasn't my car. It was an old, beat-up van that had been hidden further up the logging trail. I watched as the man walked out of the house, locked the door behind him, and drove away as if he were just leaving for work. I waited another hour before I dared to move. I ran to my car, backed out of that driveway so fast I nearly went over the edge of the ravine, and didn't stop until I saw a state trooper parked at a gas station 30 miles away. The police went to the house, but the man was gone. They found the hidden cameras and the living space in the ceiling, but the rental listing had been created using a stolen identity and a burner phone. The owner of the house lived in another country and had no idea his sanctuary was being used as a hunting ground. I never finished that thesis. Every time I'm in a room with a high ceiling or a crawl space, I find myself looking up, wondering if there is someone behind the drywall, waiting for me to close my eyes. The neon sign for the Blue Marsh Rest Stop flickered with a dying hum, casting a sickly, rhythmic pulse of light across the dashboard of my car. But the surrounding wetlands were so dark they seemed to swallow the very idea of land. I had been driving for 6 hours through the coastal lowlands, where the road is nothing but a thin ribbon of asphalt suspended over miles of black water and tall, whispering reeds. It was 3 in the morning, and the fatigue was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical weight pressing down on my eyelids and making the edges of my vision fray like an old carpet. I pulled into the deserted lot, desperate for nothing more than a splash of cold water on my face and a few minutes out of the driver's seat. The rest stop was a low, concrete building that looked like it had been built in the 70s and then forgotten by time. There were no other cars in the lot, just the endless sound of crickets and the wet, heavy smell of stagnant water carried on a humid breeze. As I walked toward the entrance, I noticed a man in a faded gray uniform mopping the floor near the vending machines. He moved with a strange, jerky motion, his back to me, but as soon as the automatic door hissed open, he froze. He didn't turn around immediately. He just stood there with his hands gripped tightly around the mop handle, listening. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding thin and hollow in the cavernous, tiled room. "Is the restroom open?" The man turned slowly, and I felt a sudden, sharp instinct to turn around and run back to my car. He was thin, almost skeletal, with skin that looked like yellowed parchment stretched too tight over his bones. His eyes were wide, darting toward the windows behind me before they finally settled on my face. He didn't look like a janitor. He looked like someone who had been hiding in a cellar for a decade. He didn't answer me at first. He just stared at my chest, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. "You shouldn't have stopped here," he whispered. His voice so low I had to lean in to hear him over the hum of the vending machines. "He's been waiting for a car like yours, a silver one. He likes the silver ones because they are harder to see in the fog." I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine, despite the thick heat of the night. I told myself he was just a confused old man, perhaps someone struggling with his mental health in a lonely, thankless job. I gave him a polite, tight-lipped smile and tried to walk past him toward the restrooms, but he stepped in my way, his mop bucket clattering against the floor. "Listen to me," he hissed, grabbing my forearm with a hand that felt like a bundle of dry sticks. "There is a man outside. He isn't supposed to be here. He's been under the crawl space of the maintenance shed for 3 days, watching the cars come and go. I saw him look at your car when you pulled in. He didn't look at the building. He looked at your back seat." I pulled my arm away, my heart starting to thud against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm just going to use the bathroom and leave," I said, my voice shaking now. I hurried into the men's room, locked the stall door, and splashed cold water on my face until my skin stung. I told myself it was a prank or just the ramblings of a lonely man, but the fear had already taken root in my gut. When I walked back out into the lobby, the janitor was gone. The mop was leaning against the wall, and the bucket was overturned, a pool of soapy water spreading across the tiles like a gray stain. The automatic doors were wide open, stuck in the on position, letting the humid air and the sound of the marsh into the building. I looked out toward my car, which sat under a single, buzzing street lamp about 50 yards away. It looked so small and vulnerable in the middle of that empty pavement. I started walking toward my vehicle, my keys clenched in my hand like a weapon. The silence of the marsh was gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to be coming from the ground beneath me. As I got closer to my car, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. I knew for a fact I had locked it. I always did, especially in places like this. I scanned the perimeter of the parking lot, but there was nothing but the tall reeds swaying in the dark. Then, from the shadow of my own car, a head popped up from the passenger side. It wasn't the janitor. This man was much younger, wearing a dark hoodie, his face obscured by the gloom. He didn't run. He just stood there, leaning against my car as if he owned it. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get away from my car." The man didn't move. Instead, he pointed toward the back of my vehicle. "You got a flat, buddy?" he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "I was just trying to see if you had a spare. You shouldn't be out here with a tire like that. The marsh eats cars that break down." I didn't believe him for a second. I kept my distance, circling around to the rear of the car while keeping my eyes on him. Sure enough, my rear tire was completely shredded, the rubber sliced in clean, horizontal lines that could only have been made by a knife. I realized then that the janitor hadn't been crazy. He had been trying to warn me about the trap. "I have a phone," I said, reaching into my pocket, though I knew there was no signal. "I'm calling the police right now." The man laughed, a short, dry sound that lacked any real humor. "No one comes out here at night, friend. Not even the cops. Why don't you just let me help you change it? I've got the tools in my truck over by the shed." He pointed toward the dark maintenance shed the janitor had mentioned. I saw a movement in the shadows near the shed's base. A second figure, smaller and faster, crawling out from the crawl space. They were working together. One to distract me and one to come from behind. I didn't wait for him to finish his sentence. I didn't care about the tire or the car anymore. I bolted, but I didn't run back to the rest stop building. I knew they would just corner me inside. Instead, I ran toward the main road, the asphalt burning through my thin shoes. I could hear the heavy boots of the man in the hoodie pounding the pavement behind me, his breath coming in loud, ragged bursts. "Stop running," he yelled, his voice no longer calm. "You're just making it harder on yourself." I pushed my body harder than I ever had in my life, my lungs screaming for air. I saw a pair of headlights in the distance, a massive semi-truck hauling a load of logs, its yellow fog lights cutting through the marsh mist. I didn't think. I just ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms like a madman. The truck's air horns let out a deafening blast that echoed across the water, and the screech of its massive brakes sounded like a chorus of dying machines. The truck slid for 20 feet before coming to a halt just inches from where I stood. The driver climbed out, a massive man with a tire iron in his hand, looking ready for a fight. I looked back over my shoulder. The man in the hoodie had stopped at the edge of the parking lot lights. He watched us for a moment, then melted back into the tall reeds of the marsh, vanishing as if he had never existed. The truck driver drove me to the next town,